Hi, I'm David Birchall, and this is a pod for Module 10, that's week 11, of Australian politics and active citizenship in autumn 2020 in our remote mode. I want to talk about some themes that are particular to this week, but also connect up to other weeks of the unit. Last week, you'll recall, we looked at Indigenous rights in Australia through the perspective of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people as First Nations peoples. This week we're thinking of them in the context of communal rights or minority rights as they're variously described, as it's understood in the world today. So there's links between last week's topic and this week's topic, but also with the unit as a whole, since the question of communal or minority rights connects up with the question of citizenship rights and the idea of citizenship being connected with being an active member of your community is a central part of the unit. So this hopefully connects up with different parts of the unit. And there in front of you, you'll see some themes that I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. Top right hand corner is an image from the sesquicentenary in 1938. That's 150 years from the landing of the first fleet of convicts and free white settlers in Sydney Harbour. And bottom right hand corner, the bicentennial of 1988. Similar but also different events. In each case you can see not the commemoration but demonstrations of Aboriginal Australians trying to represent a different point of view about each of those events. First, some quick thoughts on rights, and in case you're wondering what that dude with the funny hat is on the right-hand side of the screen, that's the Emperor Justinian, ancient Roman emperor from the late period of the Roman Empire, who wrote or gave his name to one of the major legal handbooks of ancient Rome and the ancient Roman Empire, something which still informs legal culture across the world today. It's the Romans, as with aqueducts and viaducts and all sorts of other things, who invented the idea of rights, though our word right in English comes from the German and not from the Latin. The ancient Roman word for right was jus, from which of course we get our word justice. And a jus, or a right, was the central fact of the Roman law of persons. You were a person, you were a real fully rounded human being because you possessed rights. And rights were understood in Roman law as being individual possessions. If I possess rights, they give me freedom from control or the authority of other people. And also, if I possess rights, they may give me power or authority over other people as well. Rights are a kind of declaration of independence for individual citizens in the Roman Empire, and a very important thing. By the time the Roman Empire had run its course, people across the Mediterranean, even if they weren't born anywhere near Rome, had things called rights of citizenship because they were Roman citizens and that mattered. And to be a Roman citizen meant to possess rights. If you fast forward about 5 to hundreds of 1,000 years to medieval England, from which our legal traditions come, the term right is starting to be used there, again now derived from the German, in a similar kind of way. The famous Magna Carta of medieval England was understood afterwards, whatever it meant at the time, as providing ordinary English folks with rights against the monarch, against the sovereign. Rights gave you freedoms from oppression from people above. It was understood to be a very valuable possession, and it made poor English people feel better than people in other countries. But it was also effectively a negative conception of rights. Rights were a freedom from the interference from people above you in the social order. As all this might suggest, until reasonably recently, rights have generally been thought of, at least in this tradition, as essentially individual things. We're equal as citizens because we equally possess equal rights. If our rights weren't equal, we wouldn't be equal as citizens, and we wouldn't think of ourselves that way either. Rights make us free and define us as free individuals. That's a long treasured possession of Western legal and political culture, and it's probably not surprising that people defend it jealously against anything they believe brings it under attack. From this perspective of this tradition, group rights or communal rights, possessions of rights by groups of people rather than individuals, can often be perceived as a threat, and often the idea of group rights is regarded with suspicion or even outright hostility on those grounds. 2,000 years of rights to protect me as an individual from other people, and now you're proposing group rights, which might overwrite my individual rights or make my individual rights seem somehow second rate. I think that helps explain why group rights are and remain controversial. The bloke on the right hand side of the screen here is the Canadian scholar, political philosopher and political scientist Will Kimlicka, who's the author of the first one of the essential readings this week. He is a liberal political thinker, and the liberal political tradition is based upon the idea of individual rights. As I said, if you read Kimlicka's stuff, he's particularly influenced by the thinking of John Stuart Mill, the 19th century liberal political philosopher, all of whose ideas really are based upon the idea of individual rights, or at least all the political philosophy of Locke is based upon individual rights. But Kimlicka, growing up in Canada, became aware that there were minority groups in Canada who were not represented properly in the Canadian Constitution or Canadian politics. There were Native Canadians, like Native Americans or Aboriginal Australians, a First People who had had their land taken away from them and possessed an increasingly tenuous connection to their history and tradition and culture. And also in Canada, there are different language groups. Most particularly, there's a majority English-speaking group of white Canadians, if I can put it that way, and a minority French-speaking francophone group as well. And French-speaking Canadians, for a long time, have insisted that they feel themselves cut off from their French historical traditions as well. So Canada has multiple fault lines of minorities, perhaps more pressing in some ways even than our own in this country. This led Kimlicka, in work he was doing as a scholar and also for the Canadian government, to try and theorise better this idea of minority or group rights. How could it articulate with citizenship rights ordinarily understood as individual rights? There have been group rights in history, but this isn't necessarily a great advertisement for them, because most often group rights have attached themselves to empires and imperial rule. The Ottoman Empire gave different kinds of rights to different religious and cultural minorities within it, but they were still second-class citizens, so they were not necessarily group rights you would want. In British Imperial India in the 19th century, bottom right-hand picture there, the British allowed or even facilitated different groups in Indian society to live under different laws, religious and ethnic. But this was partly to divide and conquer them, so that's not a great model either. So people like Kimlicka are trying to find a model that could work for us in the contemporary world, but it remains controversial for the reasons I've said already. Oddly enough, well, or maybe not, we have a model of this in Australia, more clear-cut, I think, than in a lot of other countries. And it's, of course, the case of first Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. In the Constitution of 1901, Aboriginal Australians are acknowledged as existing, but they don't possess citizenship rights. They're subjects of the British monarch, hence also the Australian monarch, but they're not citizens in any full sense. It's kind of like they're wards of the state to be taken care of, but without rights in their own right. And around about the same time, there was a notorious judgment from the High Court that put forward a doctrine called terra nullius, again a Latin term, meaning nobody's land, which appeared to suggest that Aboriginal people had ceded their rights to their land when white Australians had landed, and now were landless as well as rightsless. And these two things have gone together in arguments about Aboriginal policy ever since. Rights and land. Third dot point there. In 1938, at the sesquicentenary that I mentioned before, the emphasis of citizen protest, of Aboriginal protesters rather, was on citizenship rights, as you can see in the image on the right-hand side of the screen there. The placard that man is holding says Aborigines claim citizen rights, and there is a conference being held at the same time during the sesquicentenary, an Australian Aborigines conference, a day of mourning and protest, same theme as 1988 actually, but based upon ideas connected with rights. But even then, if you look at that flyer, you can see there's a strong conception of nationhood and ethnicity. Aborigines and persons of Aboriginal blood, I'm not sure what the distinction is there, only are invited to attend. There's a sense of Aboriginality as being a kind of national belonging. Despite the fact that throughout this period the primary emphasis of Aboriginal Australians was on activists, was on citizenship rights, McGregor points out in the second reading up on Views this week that the official term assimilation was often replaced in Aboriginal debates with the word integration, which has a different implication, and allowed for the idea of Aboriginal nationality within an Australian national state. The 1967 referendum is often taught in high schools as a kind of vital turning point in rights for Aboriginal people, and formally speaking, of course it was. Aboriginal people were given full citizenship rights under the Constitution for the first time, and subsequently being capable, were able to vote as well in elections, which gave Aboriginal Australians, at least formally speaking, the same rights as white Australians. And that should say in the second dot fund there by 1967. But by 1967, when the referendum passed, there were social and cultural changes sweeping across the world. Famously in the United States, the civil rights movement there, mounted by African American people, had taken a radical turn away simply from civil rights, the right to sit down on the bus without having to stand for white people, and into more dramatic assertions of African American national identity, even a dream to return back to Africa. The freedom rides that were held by young white university students and Aboriginal activists as well in the 1960s mimicked this changed culture in the United States. They were partly about Aboriginal rights. Bottom right, top right hand corner there you can see the young Aboriginal lawyer Charles Perkins reaching out to rural Aboriginal Australians with the message of what's going on in the big city. And bottom right hand corner, white demonstrators demonstrating against what was really segregation in the main public baths in the New South Wales town of Moree. Likewise, a few years later, the election of the Whitlam Labor government at the end of 1972 pushed this changed agenda onwards further. Now, the earlier movement towards the assimilation of Aboriginal people in the Australian nation was replaced by a different striving towards some degree of Aboriginal autonomy as some kind of separate, semi-autonomous people with their own culture and with their own title to land. And so there was the first movement towards land rights for traditional Aboriginal communities who could demonstrate a connection to the land. As Tim Rouse, who by the way is a professor attached to this university, points out in the third reading up on Views, the additional reading, not an essential reading, it's after 1967 that the terminology of Aboriginal society and Aboriginal nationhood springs up for the first time. There is, in the lexicon of Aboriginal politics, a kind of assertion of group rights defined through nationality and an idea of Aboriginal society being a distinct entity. Very rarely in that literature do you find the assertion that Aboriginal people are not part of Australia, or that Australia is entirely foreign to Aboriginal people. Rather, the assertion is that Aboriginal people were here first, and that Aboriginal people are the bedrock of the Australian nation and have not ceded the rights to the land that they possessed before the arrival of white settlers. So it's an articulation again of individual rights under the Australian Constitution and group rights associated with a sense of Aboriginal national identity and a traditional conception and ownership and title to land. This conception was revived famously in the early 1990s, of course, in Eddie Mabo's case in the High Court, where the High Court recognised a prior collective ownership over land of Aboriginal peoples, and gave the legal wherewithal for Aboriginal peoples through their lawyers to lay claim to traditional lands if they could provide historical evidence of continual possession of them. This asserted more strongly than ever before the idea of Aboriginal nationhood within an Australian nation, but not seen as requiring some kind of complete separation from that nation, rather a kind of cohabitation between the two. And for tutorial discussion, particularly in the small groups, and I hope Zoom treats you well in those groups, you might want to consider these two activities. First, the idea that, as I mentioned already, that Aboriginal society and nationhood as an ideas emerged in the late 1960s and 1970s. To what extent can those ideas be seen as a statement about group or collective rights? I think that's something worth thinking about. And can we think of examples of rights of that kind? And the second activity suggests that you might want to go back to some of the themes of last week and revisit them. Look at those NAIDOC themes for 2019, voice, treaty and truth. To what extent do they speak to ideas of group rights and an assertion of a negotiation of those rights against individual rights under the Australian Constitution? Pardon me. That should give you enough, I hope, for tutorials. Have fun. It's an important and interesting topic. Take care and stay safe.